It started as a spur-of-the-moment idea, a weekend camping trip to clear my head. Work had been brutal lately, and I just needed some peace and quiet. The plan was simple: pack light, head out to a spot I'd read about online, spend 2 nights, and come back refreshed. I wasn't exactly a hardcore outdoorsman, but I'd done my fair share of hiking and camping. Nothing fancy, just enough to feel comfortable in the woods. The spot I picked was in a remote part of the state, a few hours' drive from home. The description promised solitude, a small lake, and miles of trails. Perfect. I packed my gear: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, water, a first aid kit, flashlight, and a knife, the basics. I left early Saturday morning, excited to get away from everything for a while. The drive was peaceful. As I got closer to the campsite, the roads turned from pavement to gravel, then finally to dirt. I passed a couple of other campers on the way in, but the farther I went, the fewer people I saw. Eventually, I found a little clearing about half a mile from the lake. It was perfect, quiet, shaded by tall pines, and far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and took a deep breath. The air was cool and smelled of pine and earth. The only sounds were birds chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Exactly what I needed. The first day went smoothly. I hiked down to the lake, took some photos, and spent a few hours just sitting on a rock by the water, soaking in the silence. Later, I made a simple dinner over my portable stove and sat by the fire until the stars came out. The sky was clear, and the stars were incredible, so much brighter than in the city. I stayed up longer than I planned, just staring at the sky. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was exhausted. I fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of my sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow around the campsite. Everything was still and quiet. I lay there for a moment, listening. Then I heard it: a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding. It was close, just outside the tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I told myself it was probably an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. Still, I reached for my flashlight and knife just in case. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the front of the tent. Nothing. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. My pack was still leaning against the tree. The fire pit was just a ring of glowing coals. No sign of anything out of place. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm down. I must have imagined it, I thought. Sleep deprivation playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept listening, every little sound amplified in the darkness. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the night's fear seemed silly in the light of day. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to explore a different trail I'd seen on the map. The trail was overgrown but easy enough to follow. It wound through the forest, crossing a small stream and climbing up a ridge that offered a great view of the lake. I spent most of the day hiking, stopping now and then to take photos or just sit and enjoy the quiet. I didn't see another soul all day. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was starting to set. I was tired, but in a good way. I made another simple meal, sat by the fire, and watched the sky turn from orange to purple to black. The stars were just as stunning as the night before. I stayed up for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind in the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, the crackle of the fire. It was peaceful, so peaceful that I almost forgot about the footsteps. Almost. I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, there was no question about what had woken me. The footsteps were back, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. My pulse skyrocketed. I grabbed the flashlight and knife, sitting up as quietly as I could. The footsteps stopped again. I clicked on the flashlight and shined it around the tent. Nothing, but something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled, and every instinct screamed at me to stay alert. I sat there for what felt like hours, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, listening. But the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I lay back down, still clutching the knife, and closed my eyes. But my sleep was restless, filled with strange dreams and a constant sense of unease. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Human footprints circling my tent. They were fresh, pressed into the soft dirt, and unmistakably not mine. They circled the tent twice, then disappeared into the trees. My mind raced. Had someone been watching me? Why? What did they want? I scanned the surrounding forest, but there was no sign of anyone. Just the silent trees, standing tall and indifferent. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The campsite that had felt so peaceful now felt menacing. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just another camper passing through. Weird, yes, but not necessarily dangerous. I decided to stay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. All day, I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for footsteps that never came. I stayed close to camp, too uneasy to go far. As the sun set, my anxiety grew. I built the fire bigger than usual, the light and heat a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. I sat with my back to a tree, facing the tent, knife and flashlight within arm's reach. Hours passed. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the trees, and the stars looked down, cold and distant. I fought to stay awake, my eyes heavy, my body exhausted. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the camp. My heart slammed against my ribs. I gripped the knife so tightly my hand ached. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. My flashlight lay just out of reach. I cursed myself for not keeping it in my hand. The footsteps stopped again, right outside the firelight. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of the flames. My breath caught in my throat, every muscle in my body tense. Then, without warning, the footsteps retreated. Fast. Whoever it was, whatever it was, ran off into the woods, the sound of snapping twigs and crunching leaves fading into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. Every sound set my nerves on edge. The wind, the crackle of the fire, the distant hoot of an owl. All of it felt like a threat. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, constantly glancing around, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The footprints were still there, a stark reminder that I hadn't imagined any of it. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my heart racing. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving, but my nerves were shot. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't relax until I was back on the main road, miles from the campsite. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I don't know who or what was out there watching me, following me. But one thing's for sure, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I'm writing this down because I don't think I'll ever forget what happened that weekend. Maybe putting it into words will make it easier to understand, or maybe it won't. Either way, this is what happened. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip. I'd been on plenty of them before, and it never felt like a big deal. Just me, my tent, some gear, and the woods. I wanted to get away from the usual noise. City life, my phone constantly buzzing, the stress at work. I needed some time to clear my head. The plan was simple. 3 days in a national forest not too far from where I lived. I'd park my truck at the trailhead, hike about 10 miles into the wilderness, set up camp, and just exist for a while. Nothing fancy. I'd brought everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a water filter, first aid kit. The usual. The first day was perfect. The sun was out, but it wasn't too hot. I parked at the trailhead around mid-morning, strapped on my pack, and started walking. The trail wound through dense trees, climbing gently at first and then dropping into a narrow valley. It was peaceful, quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a stream. I remember thinking how glad I was to be out there. By late afternoon, I found a spot to set up camp. It was a little clearing not far from a small creek. There was a flat patch of ground for my tent and enough fallen wood nearby to build a small fire. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and got everything ready. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. That night, I sat by the fire, eating one of those dehydrated meals you just add water to. Not gourmet, but it did the job. The stars were out, and it was so quiet I could hear the creek flowing nearby. I stayed up for a while, just staring at the fire and listening to the sounds of the forest. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. The next morning, things felt different. It's hard to explain, but the air felt heavier. The forest, which had seemed so calm and inviting the day before, felt tense somehow, like it was holding its breath. I shook it off, figuring I was just being paranoid. I made some instant coffee, packed a small day pack with water and snacks, and decided to go for a hike. Nothing crazy, just a few miles to explore the area. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had a map and a compass, so I wasn't too worried. I followed the creek for a while, then veered off into the woods. The trees were thick, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The farther I walked, the quieter it got. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared. About an hour in, I found something strange. It was a small campsite, but it didn't look right. There was a tent, but it was collapsed and partially covered in leaves, like it had been there for a while. A rusted camping stove sat next to it, along with a torn sleeping bag. It looked abandoned, but not in the usual way. There were no signs of animals getting into it, no weather damage. It was just left there, like whoever had been using it had walked away and never come back. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. It didn't feel right. Something about it made my skin crawl. I thought about checking inside the tent, but something stopped me. I can't explain why, but every instinct I had told me not to touch it. I backed away and headed back toward my camp, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. The hike back felt longer than it should have. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I told myself I was just being jumpy, but the feeling wouldn't go away. When I got back to my camp, it was late afternoon. The sun was dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just spooked from finding that abandoned campsite. I made a small fire and cooked some dinner, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. The wind in the trees, the creak of branches, the distant hoot of an owl. It all felt too loud, too close. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. Around midnight, I heard something. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper of sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the creek. They stopped just outside my camp. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Then, after what felt like forever, they started again, circling the edge of the clearing. Whoever it was, whatever it was moving slowly, deliberately, just out of sight. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped again. I could feel my pulse in my ears, every muscle in my body tense. I waited, listening. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. I lay there for hours, too afraid to move. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was already packed. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead felt endless. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set me on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. When I finally reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But there was no one, just the empty road and the trees, silent and still. I've thought about that trip a lot since it happened. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing out there. But I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whoever or whatever it was is still out there, waiting. And I know one thing for sure, I won't be going back. It started as a simple weekend getaway. Just me, a backpack, and some quiet time out in the woods. No phone calls, no work emails, just nature, fresh air, and silence. I had it all planned. A 3-hour drive to a remote spot near a lake I found on an old hiking forum. A place so off the grid that it didn't even show up on most maps. That was exactly what I needed. Some peace, a reset. I loaded up my car Friday morning, tent, sleeping bag, a couple of freeze-dried meals, and enough water to last the weekend. I brought a basic first aid kit, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. It wasn't my first solo trip, so I wasn't too worried. I liked the solitude. There was something about being out in the wilderness with no one around for miles that made me feel alive. The drive was uneventful. I passed through a few small towns, stopping for gas and a sandwich before heading into the deeper parts of the forest. The roads turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was mid-afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that makes you breathe just a little deeper. I locked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started walking. According to my map, the lake was about 5 miles in. An easy hike. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but I didn't mind. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I found myself smiling, the tension from the week already melting away. It took me about 2 hours to reach the lake. It was beautiful, just like the pictures I'd seen. Clear water surrounded by dense forest, not a single sign of civilization in sight. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground near the shoreline, close enough to hear the gentle lapping of the water. I gathered some wood for a small fire, cooked one of my freeze-dried meals, and sat by the flames as the sky darkened. Night came quickly. The stars were brighter than I'd seen in years, and the air was crisp and cool. I sat there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, until the fire burned down to glowing embers. Then I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I woke up with the sun, made some instant coffee, and decided to explore the area around the lake. I spent most of the day wandering through the woods, following deer trails and climbing over fallen logs. I didn't see another soul, By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was starting to set. That's when things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. The forest felt quieter than it had the day before. The air felt heavier somehow. I told myself I was being paranoid. Too many horror movies, too much time alone. I forced myself to relax, made dinner, and sat by the fire again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dark woods behind me. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. Still, the feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I decided to call it an early night. I doused the fire, double-checked the zippers on my tent, and crawled inside. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was miles from the nearest town. There was no one out here but me. I fell asleep eventually, but it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up, heart racing, sure I'd heard something outside the tent. A twig snapping, leaves crunching. Every time I held my breath, listening, but the sounds never came again. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time I was sure I'd heard something. A soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Not an animal, something bigger, heavier. They stopped just outside my tent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I reached for my knife, fingers trembling. The footsteps didn't move. They just stood there, waiting. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, listening. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of my tent, exhausted but relieved. The forest looked the same as it had the day before. Calm, peaceful, almost mocking in its normalcy. I looked around for any signs that someone had been there, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing. I told myself it must have been an animal. Maybe a deer. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, half asleep and jumpy. Still, the thought of spending another night out here didn't sit well with me. I packed up my camp and decided to head back to the car. The hike out felt longer than it had on the way in. The woods felt darker, the trees pressing in on either side of the trail. I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure I was going to see someone or something following me. About halfway back, I stopped to catch my breath. The air was thick and still, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. That's when I noticed it. A footprint. It was faint, pressed into the soft dirt beside the trail. Definitely not mine. Too big, too wide. My mouth went dry. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. I started walking faster, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was nearly running. My car was just where I'd left it, sitting in the small clearing at the edge of the woods. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and practically threw myself into the driver's seat. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back. The tires kicked up dirt as I sped down the narrow road, the trees blurring past. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was still out there watching. I never went back to that lake. I never even tried to find it on a map again. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night, if I hadn't left when I did. I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. It started off as a simple idea, a weekend camping trip to clear my mind. I had been dealing with a lot lately, and the idea of getting away from the noise of life sounded perfect. I found a spot deep in the woods that wasn't too popular but still had a decent trail. The place seemed remote enough for some peace and quiet, but not so isolated that I couldn't make it back if things went wrong. Looking back now, I realize how much I underestimated nature and how quickly things can spiral out of control. I packed my gear: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 2 days, and a few basic tools. Nothing fancy, just the essentials. My phone was fully charged, and I had an old-school map in case the GPS failed. I even tossed in a first aid kit, thinking it was overkill. It was one of those bright, crisp mornings when everything feels possible. The air smelled like pine, and the sky was a perfect shade of blue. I parked my car at the trailhead, threw my backpack over my shoulder, and headed into the woods. The trail was well marked at first. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the crunch of leaves under my boots felt satisfying. There was something calming about being out there alone. No emails, no phone calls, no obligations. Just me and the forest. About an hour in, the trail started to narrow. The trees grew closer together, their branches reaching out like long fingers. I noticed how quiet it had become. The birds that had been chirping earlier were gone, and all I could hear was the wind rustling the leaves. It wasn't exactly unsettling, but it did make me a little more aware of my surroundings. I kept moving, trying not to overthink it. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing next to a stream. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was flat, and the water was close enough for convenience but far enough to avoid any risk of flooding if it rained. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and boiled water for a cup of instant coffee. Sitting by the stream, I felt like I had made the right decision coming out here. The stress of the last few weeks started to melt away. As the sun began to set, the forest took on a different character. The shadows grew longer, and the air turned colder. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal, just some canned beans and a protein bar. It wasn't gourmet, but it did the job. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering light on the trees around me. I leaned back against a log, enjoying the warmth. It was around 9 p.m. when I first heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes behind my tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer. I'd seen a few tracks earlier, so it wasn't unreasonable. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense undergrowth. Nothing. The rustling stopped as soon as the light hit the bushes. Just the wind, I told myself. Still, my pulse had quickened. I sat back down, trying to shake the unease. The fire was dying down, so I added a few more logs and decided to call it a night. I climbed into my tent, zipped up the door, and lay down on my sleeping bag. The forest outside was silent again. Too silent. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake, heart pounding with no idea why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. I lay there listening. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, hands trembling slightly. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked outside. The cold night air hit my face, sharp and bracing. I scanned the area with the flashlight, moving it slowly from side to side. The beam caught the trees, the bushes, the glint of the stream in the distance. Still nothing. Relax, I whispered to myself. It's probably a raccoon or something. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. I crawled back into the tent, leaving the flashlight next to me, just in case. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Every little sound had me on edge. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that the forest is full of noises at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slipped into a restless sleep. I woke up at dawn, relieved to see the pale light filtering through the trees. The forest felt less threatening in the daylight. I stepped out of the tent, stretching and taking a deep breath. The air was cold and fresh. The fire pit was just a pile of ash and charred wood. Everything seemed normal again. I decided to take a short hike before breakfast. There was a ridge not far from my campsite that I wanted to check out. The view I'd heard was incredible. I grabbed my map, some water, and a snack and set off. The trail to the ridge was steeper than I'd expected. My legs burned as I climbed, but the thought of the view kept me going. After about 30 minutes, I reached the top. The forest stretched out below me, an endless sea of green. The sun was just starting to rise higher, casting a golden light over the trees. It was breathtaking. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. Then I noticed something strange. Down in the valley, near where my campsite was, there was a thin column of smoke. It wasn't from my campfire, it was too far to the east. My first thought was that there must be another camper nearby. But why hadn't I seen or heard anyone? A knot formed in my stomach. Something about the smoke didn't sit right with me. It was too controlled, too deliberate. I decided to head back to camp and check it out. As I made my way down the trail, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost like it was holding its breath. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching on the leaves and twigs. When I reached my campsite, everything looked the same. My tent was still there, untouched. The fire pit was cold. But then I saw the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable. Someone had been here while I was gone. The prints circled my tent, then headed off toward the east, in the direction of the smoke. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just another hiker who had gotten curious. But if that were the case, why didn't they say hello? Why sneak around my campsite? I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then and there. But another part of me, the stubborn part, didn't want to be scared off so easily. I decided to stay, but I'd be extra cautious. I gathered more firewood, enough to keep the fire going all night, and kept my knife within reach. The rest of the day passed without incident. I kept busy, trying to push the morning's events out of my mind. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted. I cooked another simple meal, drank some tea, and watched the fire crackle and dance. The forest seemed peaceful again, but that peace didn't last. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps just outside my tent. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for my flashlight and knife. Every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening. Then, the tent fabric moved, just a slight ripple, like someone had brushed against it. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and burst out, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was no one there, just the trees and the cold night air. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the forest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My skin prickled with fear. I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone was out there watching me. I backed toward the fire, keeping the light aimed at the trees. I added more wood, the flames roaring to life. The warmth was comforting, but it didn't chase away the fear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, eyes darting at every shadow. The forest seemed alive, every rustle and crack amplified. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but no one ever did. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, bathed in morning light, seemed almost friendly again. Almost. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig made me jump. My pulse didn't slow until I saw my car parked where I'd left it. I threw my backpack into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the forest fading into the distance. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper playing a prank. Maybe it was something more sinister. I'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I've always loved being outdoors. There's something peaceful about being away from everything. No buzzing phones, no endless noise, just trees, dirt, and sky. So when I planned this solo camping trip, I thought it would be exactly what I needed to clear my head. Just me, my gear, and the woods. A weekend to reset. I picked a spot in a national forest I'd read about online. Not an official campground, but a dispersed camping area a few miles off a dirt road. The kind of place where you're not likely to run into anyone else unless they're also seeking solitude. It was late September, cool but not cold, with enough daylight to make camp before night fell. I parked my car at the trailhead, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started walking. The trail was faint, more like an old logging road, but easy enough to follow. I figured I'd hike in a couple of miles, find a nice flat spot near a stream, and set up camp. The first hour was peaceful. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the sky a soft blue between the trees. The trail was quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels or the chatter of birds. I felt good, relaxed. I found the stream just as the sun started to dip lower. The water was clear and cold, and there was a small clearing nearby, perfect for my tent. I set everything up, gathered some wood for a fire, and sat back to enjoy the evening. As the fire crackled and the sky darkened, I noticed how quiet it had become. Not just peaceful quiet, *2* quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something's off. I told myself it was nothing, just the woods settling in for the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just shadows. The beam of light caught the rough bark of the pines, the tangled underbrush, and the edge of the stream. No movement, no eyes reflecting back at me. Still, I felt watched. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Being alone in the woods can do that. Your brain starts to fill the silence with all kinds of things. I shook it off, stoked the fire, and forced myself to relax. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent and zipped up the door. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars through the mesh ceiling. The fire burned down to embers outside, casting a faint orange glow. I lay there listening to the trickle of the stream, trying to fall asleep. That's when I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps in the leaves. I froze, every nerve on edge. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Slow, deliberate steps, not an animal, definitely a person. I strained to listen, my heart thudding in my chest. The steps stopped. Then, after a few seconds, they started again, circling the edge of my camp. I reached for the knife I kept in my pack. My fingers wrapped around the handle, gripping it tight. The footsteps circled once, then stopped again. Silence. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just another camper passing through. Maybe they saw my fire and were curious. But why wouldn't they say something? Why circle my camp in the dark and then leave without a word? I lay there for what felt like forever, listening, waiting. Eventually, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The first thing I did when I crawled out of my tent was check the ground around my camp. The dirt was soft near the stream, and it didn't take long to find them. Footprints. They weren't mine. Bare feet. Large. Deep enough to tell me that whoever it was had been standing there for a while, watching. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. The forest was bright and calm, the way it always looks after a night that feels far too long. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't as weird as it seemed. Maybe someone had gotten lost and stumbled across my camp. Maybe they were barefoot because they'd been wading in the stream. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't even eat breakfast, just stuffed everything into my pack and started back toward the car. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I walked fast, almost jogging at times, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The trail seemed longer than I remembered. After about a mile, I found something that made my stomach drop. Another footprint.
Bore.
Right in the middle of the trail. It was fresh. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out here. Someone who wasn't supposed to be. I picked up my pace, my legs burning with the effort. The trail wound through a dense stand of pines before opening into a small clearing. I stopped at the edge, catching my breath. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the far side of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. Tall, scraggly hair, dirty clothes. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see enough to know he was watching me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced. What did he want? Why was he following me? I took a step back, and his head tilted slightly, like he was considering something. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I ran. The last mile was a blur. My pack bounced on my back, branches snagging at my clothes. I didn't stop until I burst out of the woods and onto the dirt road where my car was parked. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and threw my pack into the back seat. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the road, not caring about the potholes or the washboard ruts. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, miles away from the trailhead. Only then did I pull over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I sat there for a long time, heart racing, staring at the empty road ahead. I never reported what happened. What would I have said? That some barefoot guy followed me through the woods? That he didn't do anything, just watched me? It wasn't a crime to be out there. He had just as much right to the forest as I did. But still, something about him felt wrong. I haven't been camping alone since. I tell myself it's because I'm busy, that I've outgrown the need for solo trips. But the truth is, I can't shake the memory of those footprints. The way he stood there, watching, saying nothing. The woods don't feel the same anymore. Not like they used to, and I'm not sure they ever will. It started out like any other weekend camping trip. Nothing fancy, just me, my gear, and a few days away from the noise of the world. I needed a break. Work had been grinding me down, and the idea of sitting alone by a campfire with nothing but the sound of the wind and the crackle of flames sounded like the kind of therapy I couldn't buy. No cell service, no people, just peace. I chose a spot deep in the woods, about a 2-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. I'd been there once before with a friend, but this time I was going solo. The place was remote. Dense pine trees, thick undergrowth, and not another soul for miles. Exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck at the edge of the old logging road, grabbed my backpack, and started the hike in. The air was crisp, with just a hint of that cool autumn bite. Leaves crunched under my boots, and the sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It felt good to be out here again, breathing in fresh air instead of stale office air conditioning. After about an hour and a half of steady hiking, I found the spot, a small clearing next to a shallow creek, surrounded by towering pines. Perfect. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and took a deep breath. This was home for the next couple of nights. The first thing I did was set up my tent. A simple 2-person tent, nothing fancy, but reliable. I staked it down, rolled out my sleeping bag inside, and tossed in my flashlight and a book for later. After that, I collected some firewood from the surrounding area. There were plenty of dry branches and deadfall, so it didn't take long to gather enough to last through the night. I built a small fire pit with rocks from the creek and got a fire going just as the sun started to dip below the trees. The sky turned that deep shade of orange and pink that always makes you feel small and kind of humbled. I sat down on a flat rock, warmed my hands by the fire, and cooked a simple meal, just some canned chili and a couple of granola bars. As I ate, the forest around me grew darker and quieter. The chirping of birds faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. It felt peaceful but also heavy, like the kind of silence that presses on your ears. I told myself it was just because I was alone, not something I was used to. I stayed up a little while after eating, just staring into the fire and enjoying the quiet. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, made sure everything was secure, and crawled into my tent. The ground was hard beneath me, but I didn't mind. I zipped up the tent, turned off my flashlight, and lay there listening to the sounds of the forest. The gentle trickle of the creek was almost like white noise, and before long, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know what woke me up at first. One minute I was asleep, and the next I was wide awake, heart racing, staring up at the dark ceiling of my tent. For a moment, I thought it might have just been a bad dream, but then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze. My mind raced, trying to process what I was hearing. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was steady and deliberate, too heavy for something small. Footstep after footstep, slowly circling the tent. I lay there, barely breathing, listening to every step. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever or whatever was outside would hear it. I reached for my flashlight, but then stopped myself. Turning it on would only let them know exactly where I was. So I stayed still, gripping it tightly, trying to think. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then something pressed against the side of the tent, slow, deliberate pressure, like a hand running along the fabric. It moved from one side to the other, then back again. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk around a tent like that, and they sure as hell don't press their hands or paws against it. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. They were checking the tent, feeling it out. I waited, muscles tensed, until the pressure disappeared and the footsteps started again. This time moving away from the tent, back into the woods. I listened until the sound faded completely, and then I waited some more. 10 minutes, 20, 30. The forest was dead silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the tent. I sat up, my body stiff and sore from lying on the ground, and unzipped the tent. The morning air was cold and fresh, but the memory of last night made my stomach churn. I stepped out and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place at first. No footprints, no broken branches. Just the same quiet forest as before. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw it. The fire pit. The rocks I'd carefully arranged were scattered, like someone had kicked them. Not far from it, a boot print in the soft dirt. Not mine. I felt my pulse quicken. This wasn't my imagination. Someone had been here. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I just stuffed everything into my backpack, threw it on, and started hiking back the way I'd come. The trail felt different on the way back. Darker, quieter, My footsteps seemed too loud, like they were announcing my presence to the entire forest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I picked up my pace, heart pounding in my chest. The rational part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe it was just some hunter passing through. Maybe they didn't even know I was there and stumbled on my camp by accident. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The way they'd circled my tent, the way they pressed their hand against it, that wasn't accidental. About halfway back to the truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Another boot print, fresh, right in the middle of the trail. It wasn't mine. It was pointing in the same direction I was headed, like whoever made it was walking the same path not long before me. I didn't stop to think. I just kept walking, faster now, almost jogging. My breath came in quick, ragged gasps, and my legs burned, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to the truck. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw my truck parked where I'd left it, I almost cried with relief. I sprinted the last few steps, unlocked the door, and threw my backpack inside. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out, leaving the forest behind me in a cloud of dust. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away from that place. It wasn't until I was safely back in town, sitting in a diner with a cup of coffee, that I finally let myself breathe. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I say? That I heard footsteps and found a boot print? They'd think I was crazy. I never went back to that spot. In fact, I haven't been camping alone since. I still love the outdoors, but something about that trip changed me. It reminded me that there are things out there, real human things, that are far scarier than any ghost story. And sometimes the scariest part is knowing you'll never really get an answer. You'll never know who was out there or what they wanted. All you can do is move on and be thankful that you got away. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and fresh air, that makes everything feel simpler, peaceful. Every time life got too busy or overwhelming, I knew I could always pack my gear, head out into the wild, and reset. This trip was no different, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. It was late September, the perfect time to go. The air was crisp, but not too cold, and the leaves had started to change. Gold, orange, and red stretched out in every direction, covering the trees and carpeting the forest floor. I had a 3-day weekend and planned to spend it hiking and camping deep in the woods. Just me, my tent, and the kind of quiet you only find far away from other people. I had picked a spot about 4 hours from home, a national forest I'd been to once before, but not recently. It was a little remote, but that's what I liked. Fewer people meant fewer distractions. I loaded up my pack with everything I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a small first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, my knife, and a few other essentials. I drove out early Friday morning, arriving at the trailhead around 9 a.m. The parking lot was empty except for one old pickup truck parked near the edge. I didn't think much of it. This wasn't a popular spot, especially this time of year. I locked the truck, adjusted my pack, and set off. The trail started easy, flat and well-marked. The leaves crunched under my boots as I walked, and the air smelled like pine and earth. After about an hour, I reached a fork in the trail. To the left was the main path that led to a small lake a few miles in. I camped there before. It was a nice spot, but I wanted something more secluded this time. I took the path to the right. It wasn't as well traveled, but I knew it looped around and connected to the main trail farther down. The map showed a small stream that ran parallel to it, and I figured I could set up camp somewhere along there. The trail got rougher as I went. Fallen branches, thick underbrush, and steep inclines slowed me down, but I didn't mind. I wasn't in a hurry. Around noon, I found the stream. It wasn't much, just a narrow trickle of water running over smooth rocks. But it was enough. I followed it for another half-mile before finding a flat spot to set up camp. It was perfect. The ground was soft but dry, with plenty of space for my tent. Tall trees surrounded the area, their branches stretching overhead like a natural canopy. The stream was close enough to hear the water flowing, but far enough that it wouldn't keep me up at night. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and got to work. By mid-afternoon, the tent was up, my sleeping bag unrolled inside. I collected some firewood, built a small fire, and sat down to eat a late lunch. Just a sandwich and some trail mix. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. It was peaceful. As the afternoon faded into evening, the temperature dropped. I threw a few more logs on the fire and sat back, watching the flames dance. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was almost too quiet. I told myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in the woods can do that to you, make you hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped the flap shut. The ground was firm but comfortable enough. I closed my eyes, listening to the soft gurgle of the stream. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly. It was dark, pitch black except for the faint glow of the moon through the trees. I lay there, straining to hear what had woken me. There it was again, a soft crunch of leaves like footsteps. I held my breath, listening. Another crunch, closer this time. It stopped right outside my tent. My heart was racing. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but the sound didn't come back. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. Still, it took me a long time to fall back asleep. I woke up early, the sky just starting to lighten. The air was cold and damp. I crawled out of the tent, knife still in hand, and scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I decided to stay busy. I boiled some water for coffee, packed a small bag, and set off to explore. The trail was rough but manageable. I followed the stream for a while, then cut through the woods, taking my time. The forest was beautiful. Tall trees, patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy, the smell of damp earth and pine. But no matter how far I walked, that feeling stayed with me, like I was being watched. Around midday, I stopped to eat and check my map. I was farther out than I'd planned, so I decided to head back. The walk felt longer this time. The trees seemed closer together, the shadows darker. When I finally made it back to camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I built a fire, cooked a quick dinner, and tried to relax. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't just paranoia, I was sure of it now. I wasn't alone out here. I sat by the fire, my knife in my lap, staring into the darkness. The woods were silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. Then, just like the night before, I heard it. Crunch. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They stopped just beyond the firelight. I stood up, holding the knife out in front of me. "Who's there?" I called. My voice sounded strange in the quiet, too loud. No answer. The footsteps started again, circling the camp. I turned to follow the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay back," I shouted. Still nothing. The footsteps stopped again, just out of sight. I stood there, knife in hand, every nerve on edge, waiting. The fire crackled behind me, the only light in the dark. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, without warning, something crashed through the underbrush. running fast, disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out. The trail back felt different, longer, steeper. Every sound made me jump. Halfway back to the trailhead, I stopped to catch my breath. My chest was tight, my legs burning. I leaned against a tree, trying to calm down. That's when I saw it. About 50 feet away, partially hidden behind the trees, was a figure. A man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. He was wearing a dark jacket and jeans, his face shadowed by the trees. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. Neither did he. Then, slowly, he turned and walked into the woods. I waited until he was out of sight, then took off down the trail, running as fast as I could. My pack bounced against my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. My truck was still there, right where I'd left it. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, gravel flying. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, barely stopping for gas. When I finally walked through my front door, I collapsed on the couch, every muscle in my body aching. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, trying to process what had happened. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I don't know how long he'd been watching me, but I do know one thing: he wasn't just passing through. He was waiting, and I'll never go back to that forest again. Camping alone always gave me a strange kind of peace, far from the noise and chaos of life. It was just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind brushing through the leaves. There was something pure about it. No notifications, no schedule, just survival in its simplest form. This time, I decided to camp in a national forest that wasn't too far from home. Not a popular spot, but that was exactly why I chose it. I wanted isolation, somewhere off the beaten path, just me and nature. I'd been hiking for hours that afternoon, following a trail that eventually split off into a less traveled, overgrown path. I knew it was probably a hunter's trail or some forgotten fire road, but it didn't matter. Felt right, and that was all I needed. I set up camp in a small clearing by a creek, far from the main trail. My tent was tucked between a few tall pines, and the sound of the water nearby was soothing. The air smelled fresh, damp earth and pine needles. After pitching my tent, I gathered some firewood and built a small fire to cook my dinner. Simple stuff: a can of chili, a couple of granola bars, and some instant coffee. By the time I finished eating, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I threw a few more logs on the fire, watching the flames dance as the light faded. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, and the fire became more of a necessity than a luxury. The first few hours of the night were uneventful. Just me sitting by the fire, listening to the crackling wood and the occasional rustle of leaves. Probably a squirrel or something moving in the underbrush. Normal forest sounds. I didn't realize how tired I was until my head started nodding forward. I decided to call it a night, putting out the fire and crawling into my tent. The air inside was cold and still. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and lay there, staring at the roof of the tent. That's when I heard it. A crunch. It was faint but distinct. Not the sound of a branch falling or the wind shaking leaves. It was the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but the steps were too deliberate, too slow. They stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I held my breath, listening. My heart was pounding in my chest, every beat thudding in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination. But then it happened again. Another crunch, closer than before. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling in the dark until I found it. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness inside the tent. Slowly, I unzipped the tent door, just enough to peek outside. The forest was dark, the only light coming from the pale sliver of moon above. The trees stood like black skeletons against the sky, their branches reaching out like crooked fingers. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I stayed like that for a few minutes, listening, my breath visible in the cold air. But the sound didn't come back. Satisfied that I was just hearing things, I zipped the tent shut and lay back down, the flashlight still in my hand. I left it on just in case. Minutes passed, then an hour. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. This time it was closer than ever, right outside the tent. I froze, my hand tightening around the flashlight. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel it. Someone was standing right outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the fabric of the tent shifted. It wasn't much, just a small tug, like someone brushing against it. But in that moment, it felt like the whole world stopped. I wanted to scream, to jump out of the tent and run, but my body refused to move. Every instinct I had was telling me to stay still, to wait. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance until the forest was silent again. I lay there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a hiker who got lost? A hunter? Or something worse? When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I crawled out of my tent, every muscle in my body aching from staying tense all night. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening, almost peaceful. But then I saw the footprints. They circled my tent, large and deep in the soft earth. Not animal tracks, human. I followed them for a few yards, but they disappeared into the underbrush. Whoever it was, they'd been watching me for a while. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands trembling. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the main trail felt longer than it should have. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made my heart jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was no one, just the endless trees. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that place. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just some hiker passing through. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I don't know why I agreed to it in the first place. Camping was never really my thing. Don't get me wrong, I love being outdoors. I like hiking, breathing fresh air, and enjoying the quiet away from the city. But something about being deep in the woods, far from anyone, always put me a little on edge. Still, I figured one weekend wouldn't kill me. A chance to unplug and clear my head, right? So that's how I ended up driving out on a Friday afternoon with my backpack, tent, and enough snacks and supplies to last a couple of days. The spot I picked was pretty far off the beaten path. One of those places you only find by word of mouth. A friend had mentioned it once. A small clearing near a stream, surrounded by tall pines, about a 5-mile hike from the nearest trailhead. It sounded perfect. Quiet, peaceful, away from crowds. Exactly what I needed. The hike in was uneventful. The sun was still high, casting a golden light through the trees. I could hear birds chirping and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The air smelled clean, pine and earth, with a faint trace of the stream I was headed toward. When I finally reached the clearing, it was just as my friend had described. Flat, grassy, and just big enough for a tent. The stream gurgled a few yards away, its water clear and cold. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, unpacked my gear, and sat for a while just taking it all in. The silence was heavy, not oppressive exactly, but noticeable. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. It was almost too quiet. I tried to shake off the weird feeling. This was what I wanted: peace, solitude, time to clear my head. After setting up camp, I decided to explore a bit. The woods were thick but manageable. I followed the stream for a while, noting how it twisted and turned through the landscape. The deeper I went, the darker it seemed to get, even though it was still early evening. I found some animal tracks, deer mostly, and a few old, half-rotten logs covered in moss. Nothing unusual. After about an hour, I headed back to camp, built a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. By the time the sun set, the temperature had dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in a blanket and watched the flames flicker, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the soft rush of the stream. That's when I first heard it, a rustling sound, somewhere in the trees behind me. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I froze, listening. It was faint, but definitely there. Footsteps moving through the underbrush, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and branches, but nothing else. The footsteps stopped. Probably a deer, I muttered to myself, lowering the flashlight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat there for a long time, staring into the dark, my ears straining for any sound. Eventually, the fire burned down to embers, and I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, listening to the wind rustling the leaves outside. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise made me sit up, heart pounding, until I convinced myself it was nothing. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was shining. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue, and the weirdness of the night before felt like a bad dream. I made some coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to hike further up the stream. The day passed quickly. I followed the stream for miles, stopping to take pictures and admire the scenery. It was beautiful, untouched, wild. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the shadows were stretching long and dark across the ground. That's when I noticed something strange. The fire pit I'd built the night before was gone. Not just scattered or messed up, completely gone, like it had never been there. The rocks I'd used to circle the fire were gone too. My first thought was that I'd gotten turned around somehow, that maybe this wasn't my campsite. But then I saw my tent, right where I'd left it. My gear was untouched. Everything was exactly the same except the fire pit. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to tell myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe an animal had dragged the rocks away. Maybe I just misremembered where I built it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided not to build another fire that night. I wasn't hungry, anyway. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, leaving my flashlight within arm's reach. I lay there for hours listening. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside. I could hear breathing, soft, shallow, just on the other side of the nylon wall. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent, back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, wide-eyed, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching me from the trees. The hike back to the trailhead felt like it took twice as long as it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, threw my gear in the back, and slammed the door shut. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. I never figured out who or what was out there that night. I told myself it was probably just some weirdo messing with me, some local who thought it would be funny to scare an out-of-towner. But the more I think about it, the less that makes sense. Who hikes 5 miles into the woods just to mess with someone? And how did they move so silently, disappearing without a trace? I don't know, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is, I'm never going camping alone again. I still don't know why I thought it was a good idea to go camping alone. Maybe I needed to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and the city was suffocating. The idea of getting away for a weekend sounded perfect. Just me, the trees, and the silence of the forest. I picked a spot in a national park a few hours away, packed my gear, and hit the road early on Friday morning. I didn't tell many people where I was going. Looking back, that was my first mistake. The drive was uneventful. I had my windows down, letting the cool morning air fill the car. The forest was beautiful. Dense trees with golden leaves, the sunlight cutting through in beams. I parked at the trailhead and started hiking around noon. My destination was a spot about 5 miles in, where a small clearing near a creek promised a peaceful campsite. The hike was harder than I'd anticipated. My pack felt heavier with each step, and the trail was steep in places. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No more distant hum of cars, no other hikers, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to enjoy it, but there was an edge to the silence that unsettled me. I reached the clearing a little after 3 p.m. It was perfect. The creek ran clear and cold, bubbling softly over rocks. The ground was flat with plenty of space for my tent. I set up camp quickly, feeling proud of myself. By 4 p.m., my tent was up, my sleeping bag unrolled, and my small campfire crackling. I sat down on a log, eating a sandwich, and took in the surroundings. The forest felt alive, but in a calm, steady way, the kind of life you can feel if you're quiet enough to notice. As the sun began to set, the air grew colder. I added more wood to the fire and pulled on a jacket. The shadows stretched longer, and the trees seemed to close in around me. It was a strange sensation, like the forest was watching. I shook it off. I was just tired from the hike. By 7 p.m., it was dark. The fire was my only light, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I sat close to it, feeling its warmth, and tried to relax. I told myself this was what I came for: peace, quiet, solitude. But there was something about the darkness that felt heavier out here. The kind of dark you don't get in the city, where there are always streetlights and passing cars. This was complete darkness except for the fire. Around 9 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped myself into my tent, and lay down in my sleeping bag. The sound of the creek was soothing, and for a while, I listened to it, letting it lull me towards sleep. Then I heard it, a single snap of a twig. Close. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. I held my breath, straining to hear more. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the creek. Then, another sound, soft but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the leaves and twigs just outside my tent. I told myself it was an animal, A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too heavy, too steady. They circled my tent, slow and methodical, stopping right by my head. I wanted to look, to unzip the tent just an inch and peek outside. But I couldn't move. My body refused to listen. All I could do was lie there, heart pounding, every muscle tense. The footsteps started again, moving to the front of the tent. They stopped directly in front of the zipper. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever, whatever, was out there stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a sound, it walked away. I lay there for hours, too scared to move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was another hiker who stumbled onto my campsite by accident. But why wouldn't they say anything? Why just stand there and walk away? Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was just starting to rise. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, half expecting to see footprints in the dirt. But there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. I told myself I'd imagined it. The isolation was getting to me. It was easy to let your mind play tricks on you when you're alone in the woods. I made some instant coffee, packed up my gear, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. I decided to hike a little deeper into the forest. Maybe putting some distance between me and that spot would help clear my head. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to push through thick brush. The trees here were taller, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. It was darker, quieter, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. About 2 miles in, I found another clearing. Smaller than the first, but it would do. I set up my tent again, built another fire, and tried to settle in. The strange feeling from the night before lingered, but I pushed it aside. This was supposed to be an adventure, not a nightmare. By late afternoon, the sky had turned gray. A cold wind swept through the trees, rattling the branches. I gathered more firewood, stacking it high next to the fire pit. I wasn't going to let the darkness catch me off guard again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit the fire and sat close to it, staring into the flames. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself and tried to enjoy the warmth. Then, just like the night before, I heard it. A twig snapping, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the camp. I grabbed my flashlight, heart hammering in my chest. I shined it into the darkness, but the beam barely penetrated the thick forest. The footsteps stopped. The only sound was the wind and the crackling of the fire. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stood there, flashlight in one hand, a heavy stick in the other, turning in slow circles. My eyes scanned the darkness, looking for any movement, but there was nothing. For hours, I sat by the fire, too scared to go back into the tent. Every time the wind rustled the leaves, I tensed up, expecting to hear those footsteps again, but they never came. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp in record time. My hands shook as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted out of the forest. Teehee hike back to the car was a blur. I barely noticed the beauty of the woods this time. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I felt like I was being watched, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my pack in the back seat, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were still shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, surrounded by people and noise. Only then did I start to feel safe again. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I've replayed those nights over and over in my head, trying to make sense of what happened. I tell myself it was just my imagination. The mind can do strange things when you're alone in the woods. But deep down, I know the truth. Someone was out there with me, watching, waiting, and I'll never know who it was or what they wanted. I haven't been camping since. I don't know exactly when it started to feel wrong. Maybe it was sometime after sunset, or maybe earlier. But by the time I realized I was in real trouble, it was already too late. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Just nerves, the kind you get when you're alone in the woods. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had planned this camping trip for weeks. 3 days out in the wilderness by myself. A little escape from the noise of the world. No phone calls, no emails, no traffic. Just me, my tent, a fishing rod, and the quiet. I'd done this before, though never in this particular area. A place called Black Hollow, tucked deep in the mountains, far from any towns or well-marked trails. That was part of the appeal. It wasn't a popular spot, so I knew I wouldn't be running into many other hikers. The first day went smoothly. I parked my car at the end of a dirt road and hiked about 6 miles in. The air was crisp, the trees thick and towering above me. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels darted across the trail. I found a spot near a slow-moving creek and set up my camp. A small tent, my sleeping bag, and a little fire pit I built with rocks from the creek bed. I spent the afternoon fishing, caught 2 decent-sized trout, and cooked them over the fire. The sky turned orange, then purple, and finally black as the stars came out. I felt good, relaxed. This was exactly what I needed. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the creek and staring into the flames until I got tired and crawled into my tent. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, confused. My tent was pitch black, and for a second, I couldn't remember where I was. Then I heard it, a soft sound outside. Footsteps. They weren't loud, just a faint crunching of leaves, maybe 20 feet from my tent. My first thought was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps moved closer, slow and deliberate, not like an animal at all. I held my breath. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I hadn't seen a single person all day. My camp wasn't near any trail, and I was at least 6 miles from the nearest road. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my chest. I wanted to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight outside, but something stopped me. Some instinct, buried deep in my brain, screaming at me to stay still. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance until all I could hear was the creek again. I lay there for a long time, too scared to move. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I convinced myself it had to be an animal. Maybe a curious deer or a bear passing through. I couldn't explain why it had sounded so much like a person, but I told myself it was nothing. No big deal. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I packed up my camp and decided to move farther up the creek, deeper into the woods. I figured if I put some more distance between myself and whatever had been out there, I'd feel better. By mid-afternoon, I found another spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It felt more open, less claustrophobic than my first campsite. I set up my tent again and spent the rest of the day exploring the area, trying to push the previous night out of my mind. It almost worked. The second night was quieter. No footsteps, no strange noises, just the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. I stayed up late, sitting by the fire and staring at the stars. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep. I woke up at dawn, feeling rested for the first time since I arrived. I boiled some water for coffee and sat by the creek, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. The air smelled fresh, and the water sparkled as it flowed over the rocks. That's when I saw it. The footprint. It was in the mud, right near the edge of the water. Barefoot. Not huge, but definitely not a child's. I stared at it, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. It hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of that. And it wasn't mine. I always wore boots. A cold wave of fear washed over me. Someone had been here, walking around my camp while I slept. I looked around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the wind in the leaves. I tried to stay calm. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was another hiker who had passed through early in the morning. But that didn't make sense. Why would someone be walking around barefoot miles from any trail? I packed up my camp in record time. The hike back to my car felt different than the hike in. Every sound made me jump. The wind, the birds, the crunch of my own footsteps. All of it set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. But the trail stayed empty. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached my car. I threw my gear in the back and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the middle of the road, watching me. But there was nothing. I didn't relax until I hit the highway. Even then, it took a while for my heartbeat to slow down. I never went back to Black Hollow. I still love camping, but I stick to well-known areas now, places with other people around. I tell myself it was probably just another camper, someone passing through at the wrong time. But deep down, I know that's not true. There was someone out there with me, someone who didn't want to be seen. And whoever it was, they were watching me the whole time. I've always loved camping. The quiet of the woods, the smell of pine and dirt, the feeling of being far away from all the noise back home. It's my kind of escape. I've been on solo trips before, and while most of them were pretty uneventful, that particular weekend trip into the backcountry of Montana will probably haunt me for the rest of my life. I planned everything out as I always did. I packed my gear meticulously. Tent, sleeping bag, plenty of water, food for 3 days, a first aid kit, my GPS, a multi-tool, headlamp, and a small camping stove. I even brought my bear spray, something I never forget when heading into the wild. I chose a spot about 15 miles off any main trail, deep in an area where I was almost certain I wouldn't run into another soul. Solitude is what I was after, and this place seemed perfect for it. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The drive was peaceful, winding roads through dense forests that seemed untouched by time. The trailhead was almost hidden, just a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. I parked my truck, shouldered my pack, and set off. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with sound. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, the distant rush of a stream. I felt at home. I followed the trail for a while before veering off into the thicker part of the woods, aiming for a small clearing I had marked on my map. It was a secluded spot near a shallow creek, surrounded by towering pines. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I quickly set up my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and boiled water for my freeze-dried meal. As the fire crackled and the first stars appeared overhead, I leaned back against a log and let the calm wash over me. This was why I loved camping. No distractions, no emails, no noise. Just me and the wilderness. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, the forest still cloaked in mist, and spent the morning exploring the area. I followed the creek for a while, spotting deer tracks and a few scattered feathers where some predator had made a kill. I even found a quiet pool where I refilled my water bottle and sat for a while, just listening to the gentle trickle of water. It wasn't until late that afternoon that things started to feel off. I was gathering more firewood when I noticed something strange. A tree about 50 yards from my campsite had deep scratches running down its trunk, claw marks at least 6 feet off the ground. They were fresh, bits of bark still hanging loose where they'd been gouged out. I froze, my pulse quickening. Bears, I thought. Maybe a black bear. But these marks were too high, too deep. Grizzly? I knew they were rare in this area, but it wasn't impossible. I scanned the surrounding forest, my eyes darting between the trees. Nothing moved. The woods were eerily silent, the usual chatter of birds and insects strangely absent. My skin prickled. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was probably nothing. Animals roam, they leave marks. It didn't mean one was nearby. Still, I kept my bear spray within easy reach as I finished collecting wood and returned to camp. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fire seemed too small, its flickering light barely pushing back the darkness pressing in from the woods. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a deer moving through the trees. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was dead silent. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd jolt awake at the slightest sound. My heart pounded in my chest, and I found myself straining to hear anything beyond the crackle of the dying fire. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush just beyond the edge of the firelight. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up slowly, gripping the bear spray with trembling hands. The footsteps stopped. I peered into the darkness, my eyes struggling to adjust. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely breathing, every muscle in my body tensed. But the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I found tracks around my camp. Not animal tracks, human, barefoot. They circled my tent, wandered toward the creek, then disappeared into the woods. My stomach twisted into knots. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been watching me. I packed up camp in record time. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave, but I forced myself to stay calm. If I panicked, I'd make mistakes. I slung my pack over my shoulder, checked my GPS, and started back toward the trailhead. I kept my pace steady, resisting the urge to break into a run. The woods felt suffocating now, every shadow a potential threat. My head was on a constant swivel, scanning the trees, listening for anything out of place. I kept thinking about the tracks, how close they had come to my tent, how long that person must have stood there watching me. About 5 miles from the trailhead, I smelled smoke. Not campfire smoke, something else. Thicker, acrid. My stomach sank as I crested a small ridge and saw it. A column of black smoke rising from the direction of the trailhead. My truck. I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face, my legs burning with every step. The closer I got, the stronger the smell of burning rubber and plastic became. When I finally stumbled into the clearing where I'd left my truck, my worst fear was confirmed. It was completely destroyed, charred metal and shattered glass. The tires melted down to puddles of rubber. My mind raced. Whoever had been watching me last night had followed me. They torched my truck, cutting off my only way out. I was 15 miles from the nearest road, with no cell service and no way to call for help. I had 2 options: stay and wait for someone to find me, or start walking. I chose to walk. I stuck to the trail, moving as quickly as I could without exhausting myself. I had enough food and water for another day, maybe 2 if I rationed carefully. My biggest fear was that whoever had done this was still out there, watching me, waiting. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. The hours dragged on. My legs ached. My shoulders throbbed under the weight of my pack, but I didn't stop. By late afternoon, I was delirious with exhaustion and dehydration. My water was running low, and I hadn't seen the creek in miles. Then, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were behind me, faster than before, closing the distance. I didn't think. I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining on me. My mind was a blur of panic and adrenaline. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I couldn't let them catch me. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst into a clearing and saw it. A small dirt road cutting through the forest. I sprinted toward it, almost collapsing as I reached the edge. A truck was parked a few hundred yards down the road, its engine idling. I waved my arms, screaming for help. The driver, a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt, jumped out and ran toward me. His eyes widened when he saw the state I was in, covered in dirt and scratches, gasping for breath. "Jesus, what happened to you?" he asked. I couldn't get the words out. I just pointed back toward the woods, toward whatever was still out there, hiding in the trees. He didn't ask any more questions. He helped me into his truck, handed me a bottle of water, and drove me straight to the nearest ranger station. I told them everything, the tracks, the fire, the footsteps, but they never found whoever was out there. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some twisted prank. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. The trip started out as a much-needed escape. Work had been dragging me down for months, and I couldn't take the monotony of waking up every day just to stare at a computer screen for hours on end. So, when I finally got a long weekend, I decided to go solo camping in the national forest about 3 hours from home. It wasn't my first time camping alone. I've always found something calming about the isolation of it, the simplicity of life in the woods, away from the constant noise of the city. No texts, no emails, just quiet. I packed light but made sure I had everything essential. My tent, sleeping bag, food for a couple of days, my trusty camping stove, a water filter, and a small first aid kit. My knife and a small hatchet were in the side pocket of my backpack, and I carried a headlamp with extra batteries. I left early Friday morning, hoping to get to my campsite before noon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a light breeze, not too hot. The drive up was uneventful, the roads mostly empty, and by the time I turned off the main highway onto the gravel road that led into the woods, I was already feeling more relaxed. The forest was dense, with tall pines stretching endlessly in every direction. The road narrowed as I drove deeper in, the trees pressing close on either side. My campsite was about 2 miles from the trailhead, near a small lake. It wasn't an official campground, but I'd found it a year ago on another trip. Back then, it had been perfect, quiet, secluded, with a flat spot for my tent and easy access to the water. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The trail was familiar, winding gently uphill through the trees. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was high overhead. I set up my tent in the same spot as before, on a flat patch of ground a few yards from the lake. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and I could already feel the tension draining from my body. After setting up camp, I sat on a rock by the lake, eating a sandwich and watching the water. There was no one else around, just me, the trees, and the occasional bird. The afternoon passed quickly. I spent some time gathering firewood, then walked down to the lake and filtered some water to refill my bottles. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. A simple meal of instant noodles and canned tuna. Not gourmet, but it tasted damn good after a day of hiking and setting up camp. By the time the sky turned pink and orange, I was feeling content and a little drowsy. The woods around me were peaceful, the air cool and still. Then I heard it, a soft sound, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, a rustling in the bushes behind me. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a raccoon or a deer, maybe, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't the random rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush. It was deliberate, slow. I turned, peering into the shadows. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond its circle of warmth, the forest was dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The hair on the back of my neck standing up, a sudden tightness in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I added more wood to the fire, the flames flaring up, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. The woods are full of noises, especially at night. I'd spent enough time camping to know that. Still, I kept my knife within reach as I climbed into my tent and zipped it shut. The forest was quiet now, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the tent's ceiling, my ears straining for any hint of movement. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake, heart pounding with no idea why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow through the tent walls. The forest was pitch black, the air cold and still. I lay there holding my breath, listening, and then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate footsteps. They were close, too close. My mind raced. It had to be another camper, someone who had stumbled onto my site by accident. But it was the middle of the night, and I hadn't seen another soul all day. I reached for my knife, my hand trembling. The footsteps stopped, just outside the tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast in the silence. I gripped the knife tighter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then the tent zipper started to move. Slowly, I froze. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The zipper stopped halfway down, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then a hand reached inside. It was dark, but I could see the outline of it. A pale hand, the fingers long and thin. It fumbled for a moment, then grabbed the edge of the tent and pulled it open wider. I reacted without thinking. I lashed out with the knife, the blade slicing through the air. The hand jerked back, and there was a sharp cry, a man's voice, filled with pain and surprise. I scrambled out of the tent, the knife still in my hand. My eyes darted around, searching for whoever or whatever had been there, but there was no one, just the dark woods and the faint echo of footsteps retreating into the trees. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was he? What did he want? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and started running back toward the trailhead. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made me flinch, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The trail was harder to follow in the dark, but I didn't dare stop. I kept moving, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint outline of my car through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down until I was inside, the doors locked, the engine roaring to life. I drove away without looking back, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, the lights of a gas station glowing like a beacon in the distance. I pulled in, parked under the bright lights, and sat there for a long time, trying to calm my breathing. It wasn't until I saw the blood on my knife, the thin smear of red along the blade, that it really sank in. Whoever he was, I'd hurt him. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. I called the local rangers the next morning and reported the incident, but they didn't find anyone. No tracks, no blood, nothing. I haven't been back to that campsite since. Maybe it was just some crazy guy, someone looking for trouble. Or maybe it was something worse. Either way, I'm done with solo camping. Some things just aren't worth the risk. It was just supposed to be a quiet hike. Something simple. A few hours in the woods. A chance to clear my mind and stretch my legs. I've done it 100 times before. Picked a trail, grabbed my gear, and walked into the trees, just me and the world. No company needed, no distractions. I love the outdoors, the peace it gives me. But this time, things didn't go as planned. This time, I didn't come back the same. It was late September when I decided to take the trail that day. I remember because of the chill in the air, the kind of crispness that only comes with autumn creeping in. The leaves were changing, patches of orange, yellow, and red scattered across the trees. I thought it'd be the perfect time for a quiet walk, so I grabbed my pack and set off early. The trail I picked was one I'd done before, a route that wound through the woods, following the edge of a creek before slowly ascending up a hillside. Nothing too difficult, nothing too far. Just a nice, peaceful walk, or so I thought. The trailhead was just off a small country road, and I pulled my car into the lot, locking it behind me. I was alone, but that didn't bother me. I preferred it that way. First, everything was fine. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the smell of wet earth in the air, the soft babble of the creek as I crossed it. It all felt normal, comfortable, the kind of peaceful solitude I'd been craving. I'd been walking for about an hour when I noticed something off. It wasn't much, just a slight feeling that I wasn't alone. I shook it off, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It happens sometimes when you're alone in the woods. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above me, and the sound of birds chirping had quieted down. I noticed that the trail had started to get steeper, but I wasn't worried. It wasn't a difficult climb, just a steady incline. But the farther I went, the more I felt it, like someone was watching me. At first, it was easy to dismiss. The sound of sticks snapping in the distance, the rustling of leaves. But after a while, it became hard to ignore. I began to speed up, hoping that the feeling would pass. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed, hanging in the air, weighing on me like a heavy cloud. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I was just being paranoid. There's no one out here, I thought. The trail was remote, after all. People didn't come out here often. I was too far into the woods for anyone else to be around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, about 2 hours into the hike, I noticed something strange. I had crossed a small bridge over a stream, and as I looked around, I saw what I thought was a figure moving through the trees. It was quick. Too quick for me to make out details, but I definitely saw it. It wasn't an animal. It was human-shaped. I froze, heart pounding. I waited for a few seconds, listening for any sound, any movement. But there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. I stepped forward cautiously, trying to stay quiet, but the noise of my boots on the rocks and dirt made me feel like I was walking on glass. After what felt like forever, I decided it was nothing. My mind was just playing tricks on me, probably an animal or a shadow from the trees. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, and continued up the trail. The trees began to thin out, and I found myself standing on the edge of a small clearing. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the ground. It was getting late, but I wasn't worried. The trail looped back toward the car from here. I just had to keep going for a little while longer. But then I heard something. It was soft, distant at first. A voice, barely audible, but definitely a voice. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. It sounded like a man, calling out, just one word over and over. "Hey!" I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one. The clearing was empty, just the trees and the sound of wind. I didn't see anyone, but that voice, it wasn't my imagination. I was sure of it. I stood there for a few moments trying to calm my breathing. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd been out here too long. But no, this felt different. It was too real to ignore. I didn't know what to do. Should I go toward the voice? Should I keep moving on the trail? My instincts told me to turn back, to leave this area and not look back. But I couldn't shake the thought. What if someone was out there, hurt, needing help? After a moment's hesitation, I chose to move forward. I had to know. I couldn't just ignore it. I walked toward the source of the voice, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The clearing was narrow, only about 20 yards wide. The voice was getting louder, more insistent now, calling, "Hey!" over and over. But still, I couldn't see anyone. Then, I reached the other side of the clearing, and my foot caught on something. A root or maybe a rock. I stumbled, but caught myself, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just behind a large rock, I noticed a shape, something dark, something out of place. I didn't move for a moment, just stared at it. The voice stopped. No more "hey," no sound at all. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a step closer. And then I saw what it was. It was a backpack. A hiking backpack, dark green, lying on the ground near a small cluster of trees. There was no one around, but the pack was definitely there, untouched. A rush of unease filled me. Why was it here, alone? It didn't make sense. I looked around, but there were no other signs of a person. No trail of footsteps, no broken branches. It was as if whoever owned the pack had just vanished. I stepped closer, but before I could reach it, I froze. There was something else. Something in the trees, just beyond the clearing. A flash of movement. Someone or something was watching me. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't alone. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I turned on my heel and started walking fast, then running. The trail was further ahead, and the thought of getting back to the safety of the marked path was the only thing on my mind. But as I ran, I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Not my own, but someone else's. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The path was getting steeper now, the trail more difficult to follow. The light was fading, and I could barely see. But I didn't care. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. When I reached the point where the trail looped back toward the parking lot, I stopped. I dared to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone or something coming after me. But there was nothing. The woods were silent, empty. I felt a rush of relief. It was over. I wasn't being followed. But that didn't mean I was safe. I hiked the last stretch of the trail as quickly as I could, my heart still pounding. The trees around me began to thin, and soon, I saw the parking lot up ahead. I burst out of the woods, breathless, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I locked the door behind me and sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel. What had just happened? Who left the pack behind? Was someone else out there, lost? Or was it something else entirely? I don't know. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going back on that trail again. I started the engine and drove home, the silence in the car almost as unnerving as the woods had been. But I didn't care. I was safe now. I've always thought of myself as someone who enjoys solitude, a break from the noise of the world, just me and my thoughts. So when I found that small cabin in the woods for rent, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away, clear my head, and enjoy a few days in peace. I wasn't expecting much, just a small, secluded place to escape to. But as soon as I arrived, I felt something strange, an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite shake off. The cabin itself wasn't much. It sat in the middle of a dense forest, miles away from any neighbors or main roads. The gravel driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the wood of the cabin had the dull, grayish hue of age and neglect. I wasn't worried though. I was there for some quiet time, not to inspect the place. I pulled my car to the front and killed the engine. The silence was the first thing that struck me. No birds, no breeze, nothing. Just stillness. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and walked up to the door. It creaked as I opened it, the hinges dry from years of disuse. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected, basic, sparsely furnished. A couch, a small kitchen, a single bed tucked in the corner with a thin quilt. There were a few shelves with some old books and a fireplace against one wall. The air was musty, thick with the smell of wood and dust. The windows were covered with heavy, dark curtains that blocked out any light from the outside. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't cozy either. I threw my bag down onto the bed and started exploring the place, looking for any signs of life or death. There was a small bathroom, a single mirror above the sink, a few towels hanging on a hook. The whole place seemed untouched, as if no one had been there for years. The quiet was almost oppressive. After a while, I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. I needed a break from the stifling atmosphere inside. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest. The trees around the cabin were so thick that only a sliver of sky peeked through the gaps. I walked a little ways into the woods, just enough to stretch my legs. The quiet was even more intense out there, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to push the unease out of my mind. I had rented this place because I wanted to get away from the distractions of everyday life. The fact that it was so remote, so empty, was supposed to be a selling point. But as I walked further, I couldn't ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone or anything. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the silence pressed in on me from all sides. I decided to head back to the cabin. As I turned around, something caught my eye, an odd shape in the distance. It wasn't far from the cabin, just past a cluster of trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but it seemed out of place, as though it didn't belong there. My curiosity got the better of me, so I started walking toward it. The closer I got, the more uneasy I became. It was a small, weathered shack, barely visible through the thick trees. There was something about it that felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the air around it was thicker, charged with a kind of heaviness. The shack itself looked abandoned. Its walls were falling apart, and the roof was caved in on one side. It was a miracle it was still standing at all. I stood there for a few moments, staring at it. Something in my gut told me to leave, to turn around and go back to the cabin. But my feet refused to move. Something was pulling me toward it, some deep instinct that I couldn't ignore. I finally stepped closer, careful to avoid stepping on any loose boards or fallen branches. The door of the shack was hanging off one hinge, barely attached to the frame. Inside, I could see remnants of old furniture. A chair, a table, and something that looked like a mattress on the floor. There were no windows, and the inside of the shack was pitch black, even though the sun was still setting. I wanted to leave. I really did, but I couldn't. I stepped inside. My breath echoed in the empty space as I took in the decaying surroundings. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. There was an odd smell in the air too. Something metallic, like blood, but stale and old. As I moved further in, my foot kicked something hard. I bent down and found a rusted metal box, half buried in the dirt. My heart started to race. I reached down and opened it, expecting to find old, worthless trinkets. Instead, there was a thick, worn notebook inside. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong with the other junk in the box. I pulled it out and flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with neat, almost obsessive writing. Notes, dates, names, and places that I didn't recognize. But as I flipped through it, something began to stand out. The entries became more erratic, the handwriting shaky and hurried. The last entry made my stomach churn. _ I can hear them outside now. They know I'm here. I can feel them watching. It's only a matter of time before they come inside. _ I slammed the book shut and jumped back, my heart racing in my chest. I hadn't noticed it before, but the temperature in the shack had dropped significantly. The air felt colder, almost biting. I took one last look at the shack and bolted out the door. As I ran back to the cabin, I could have sworn I heard something. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following me. By the time I made it back to the cabin, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and threw the bolt across. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew I didn't want to be anywhere near that shack. The rest of the night was a blur of pacing and anxiety. The silence around the cabin seemed even more oppressive, like it was closing in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I lay down in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. The only sound in the cabin was the occasional creak of the wooden walls as the house settled. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something outside, a faint scraping sound, like something or someone was moving around the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I forced myself to stay calm, to reason with myself. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or something small. But then the scraping sound stopped, and I heard something else. A low, guttural noise, almost like breathing, but slow and uneven. It was coming from just outside my window. I slowly got out of bed, my body trembling. The curtains were still drawn, but I had to know. I slowly moved toward the window and peered through a small gap between the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was something standing just outside the cabin. It wasn't human, at least not in the way I understood it. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its skin was pale and thin, like it had been stretched too tight over a skeleton. Its eyes, black and hollow, were staring directly at me through the window. For a long moment, neither of us moved. And then, slowly, it lifted its hand. The fingers were long, unnaturally long, and they tapped against the glass. 3 sharp taps. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. I felt paralyzed, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. But then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the thing turned and vanished into the woods, leaving only the deep silence behind. I waited for hours before I dared to move again. But when I finally opened the door and stepped outside, the world was still and calm. No sign of the creature, no footsteps, no sounds. Just the same oppressive quiet I had felt when I first arrived. The next day, I packed my things and left. I didn't stop to take anything with me, not even the strange notebook. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to. All I knew was that whatever was out there in those woods, I didn't want to find it again. When I left, the world felt normal again. The silence was still there, but it wasn't oppressive. It was just quiet, and I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't sure if what I had seen was real or if it was some sort of hallucination, but I wasn't going to stay to find out. I never went back to that cabin, and I never looked up the name on the notebook or the strange, twisted entries inside it. Some things are better left forgotten. I remember that day clearly. The road ahead of me stretched into a blur of heat and dust, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had taken a detour from my usual route, just to clear my head. Nothing unusual at first, just a few hours of driving through the middle of nowhere. The engine of my old car hummed steadily, and the air smelled of dry earth. My phone had lost service miles ago, and with each passing mile, it felt like I was sinking deeper into a void. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization, just barren fields and long stretches of gravel road. I thought I'd take a scenic route, but now I was beginning to wonder if it had been a mistake. The road was narrow, winding in strange angles, and I couldn't remember the last time I had passed another person. My only companions were the occasional crows perched on the dead trees that lined the edge of the road, their black eyes seeming to follow my every move. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but a nagging unease settled in my chest, pulling at me like a weight I couldn't shake. Around midday, the heat started to get unbearable. My car's air conditioner sputtered and died hours ago. Sweat rolled down my back as I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand. I had no choice but to keep going, though. Turning around seemed like too much of a hassle. Besides, how much further could it be? A sign finally appeared, rusted and half hidden by the overgrowth. It read Warren's Hollow, 10 miles. The name did nothing to calm my nerves. In fact, it made me more uneasy. I couldn't place it, but there was something strange about that name, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I passed a dilapidated barn, its wooden planks sagging under years of neglect. The trees here seemed to grow in twisted, unnatural patterns, their branches reaching out like long, gnarled fingers. The air felt thick, as though the very atmosphere itself was weighing me down. As I turned another bend, I saw something up ahead. At first, it seemed like a mirage, an illusion created by the heat. But as I got closer, the image became clearer. A small, run-down gas station sat on the side of the road. It looked like it hadn't been in business for years. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the pump was rusted, the nozzle hanging limply like it hadn't been touched in decades. I pulled in, needing to stretch my legs and grab some water. It was the first sign of civilization I had seen in what felt like forever. The building was silent, almost too silent, as though it hadn't heard the sound of human footsteps in ages. A small, rickety door led into the station's office, and I pushed it open with a creak that echoed in the stillness. Inside, the air smelled stale and musty. The shelves were lined with dusty, expired snacks and old newspapers. There were no signs of life, no cashier, no customers. Just empty space and the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the back. I walked around, unsure of what to do. There was a counter with a register, but it looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor as I made my way to the back, hoping to find a bathroom or maybe some bottled water. That's when I noticed something strange. On one of the shelves, behind a stack of old magazines, was a small, weathered book. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Something about it drew me in. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out to grab it. The moment my fingers touched the cover, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was an odd sensation, like the book wasn't just a book, like it was waiting for me to find it. I opened the journal, and the first page was filled with what seemed to be hastily scribbled notes. The handwriting was barely legible, but the words stood out against the fading ink. They never leave. No one ever leaves, I frowned and turned the page. It was more of the same. Fragmented sentences, disjointed thoughts, as though the writer had been desperately trying to get something off their chest. A chill ran through me as I read on. It's in the land. The earth here. It doesn't let go. The pages became more erratic, as though the writer was growing increasingly agitated. My heart began to race. I flipped through the book quickly now, scanning the pages in search of something more, but everything seemed to blur together. Words about the land, about people disappearing, about something watching. I couldn't make sense of it, but I felt my skin prickling with an unease that I couldn't explain. I didn't want to stay there any longer. The atmosphere of the gas station was starting to feel oppressive, like something was watching me from the corners of the room. I stuffed the journal into my backpack, not sure why I felt compelled to take it with me, but I did. Without thinking, I left the gas station and headed back to my car. As I drove away, the feeling of being followed crept over me, settling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me from behind, from the edges of the trees, from the long stretch of empty road. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. It was then that I saw it, a figure in the distance standing on the side of the road. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He was holding something in his hands, but I couldn't tell what it was. I should have driven past. I should have kept going. But for some reason, I didn't. I stopped the car a few feet away from him, my engine idling. The man didn't move. I honked the horn, but he didn't react. I felt my pulse quicken, and I was just about to roll the window down and ask if he needed help when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was something off about the way he stood. It was as if he wasn't fully there, like his figure was fading in and out of focus, flickering like a bad TV signal. My hand shot to the door handle, ready to speed off, but before I could move, the man turned his head slowly, very slowly. I couldn't see his face. It was covered by the shadow of his hat, but something about his movement was unnatural, like it wasn't human. I floored the gas pedal without thinking. The car shot forward, and I didn't look back until I reached the main road, miles down the way. The rest of the drive was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just seen. But soon, I reached a sign for a town called Warren's Hollow, the very place I'd seen on the sign earlier. The feeling of unease was still gnawing at me, but I was too tired to keep going. I decided to stop for the night. The town was small, barely more than a handful of buildings. A motel sat on the corner, its neon lights flickering weakly. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and made my way inside. The lobby smelled of old carpet and stale coffee. The receptionist, an elderly woman with frail hands, smiled at me as I approached. Her eyes were dull, but she greeted me with a friendly enough tone, giving me the key to a room without a word. It wasn't until I stepped into the room that I felt the weight of the silence settle around me. It wasn't a loud silence. It wasn't a ghostly silence. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world outside had just stopped. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind still reeling from the events of the day. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like I was being drawn into something far bigger than I could comprehend. I pulled out the journal from my backpack and started flipping through it again. As I reached the final pages, one line stood out to me, clearer than the rest. The land calls to you. It won't let you go. You can't leave once you're here. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The walls of the room seemed to close in around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was in the room with me, something that had been there all along. It wasn't until the next morning that I understood. I left the motel, hoping to get out of town as quickly as possible. But as I drove out, I realized something horrifying. The road I had driven in on, the road that had led me to Warren's Hollow, was gone. The familiar landmarks, the signs, the gas station, everything was gone. All that remained was an empty stretch of road leading further into the wilderness. I was trapped. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me and the quiet of the woods, away from the noise of the city. The cabin I rented was tucked deep in a forested area, miles from the nearest town. No cell signal, no distractions, just the sound of nature and time to relax. I thought it would be perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still high but beginning to dip behind the trees. The cabin looked older than the photos had shown. It was small, one-story, with a sloping roof and thick, wooden beams that groaned in the wind. The porch had a swing, but the paint was chipped and faded. It was more rustic than I'd imagined, but that was okay. It added to the charm. I unpacked my things quickly. The place was musty inside, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. The windows were covered with thick curtains that I pushed aside, revealing the overgrown forest just outside. I felt a strange sense of calm mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The first night was uneventful. I spent most of it reading and drinking wine in front of the fireplace. The crackling of the wood was comforting. I didn't even realize how tired I was until my eyelids grew heavy. I set down the book, blew out the candle on the table, and turned in for the night. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, but there was something about the silence that kept me awake longer than I expected. The usual sounds of wildlife outside, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, seemed distant. Everything felt strangely still, too still. It was the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every little creak and groan in the house. At some point in the night, I heard something, a soft, tapping sound. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the window, but then it grew louder. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal either. The sound was deliberate, slow, like someone was gently tapping on the glass. My heart rate quickened. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to get up and look outside. Maybe it was just a branch, I told myself. But the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as though it was waiting for something. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and pointed it toward the window. The beam of light cut through the dark, but I saw nothing outside. The forest was as still as it had been before. No movement, no shadows. I waited for the tapping to stop. It did, but that didn't put me at ease. The longer I lay there, the more I realized how unnervingly quiet it had become. Not even the wind stirred the trees. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. I turned over, pulling the covers tightly around me, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I went out for a walk to clear my head. The forest was peaceful in the daylight, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves slowly bringing me back to my senses. I explored a little beyond the cabin, taking in the sights of moss-covered trees and the occasional deer tracks. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue. It felt like the world was miles away from anything familiar, which was exactly what I wanted. That evening, I decided to cook dinner in the small kitchen of the cabin. There was a sense of calm now, and I was looking forward to settling in for the night. As I chopped vegetables, I thought about the tapping noise from the night before. I convinced myself it had just been an odd branch hitting the window, nothing more. But then the lights flickered. I froze, knife still in hand. I turned to the overhead light, but it flickered again and then went out completely. I stood there in the dark for a moment, unsure of what to do. The house was so quiet again, except for the soft hum of the fridge in the corner. I walked to the fuse box, checked the circuit breakers, but everything seemed normal. I tried the light again, but it stayed off. Frustrated, I grabbed a few candles from a nearby shelf and lit them. The soft glow from the flames filled the cabin with a strange warmth, but the air still felt off. I shook the feeling away and finished making dinner by candlelight. After eating, I decided to take a walk around the perimeter of the cabin. I wanted to check the windows, maybe look for any signs of branches hitting the glass. anything that might explain the noises I'd heard. The sky was nearly dark now, and the trees surrounding the cabin cast long shadows across the yard. I circled the cabin twice, inspecting every window, every corner of the porch, but there was nothing. No branches brushing against the walls, no strange marks on the windows. Everything looked normal. The forest stretched out beyond, dark and silent. As I walked back to the front door, I noticed something strange. The swing on the porch was gently rocking back and forth. I hadn't touched it, and the wind wasn't strong enough to make it move. It was as if someone had just gotten off it and walked away. But the swing had been completely still when I walked around the house just moments earlier. I stood there, staring at it for a long time. I couldn't explain it. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical reason for everything that had been happening. But there was no answer, only the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. That night, the tapping started again. I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, listening, waiting. The sound began softly at first, just like before, but this time it didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic. Top, top, top. Over and over again, like something or someone was trying to get in. My pulse was racing. I grabbed the flashlight, but I didn't want to go to the window again. What if something was out there? I couldn't bring myself to look. I pulled the covers up to my chin and stared at the dark room, listening to the tapping that wouldn't stop. It went on for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sound stopped. There was nothing, just the stillness of the night. I had enough. The next morning, I packed my things, not bothering to eat breakfast. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. The tapping, the eerie silence, it was too much. I left the keys on the counter and locked the door behind me, stepping out into the cool morning air. As I drove away from the cabin, I felt a strange sense of relief. The tension in my chest finally began to loosen. But as I drove farther down the narrow dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, and for just a second, I could have sworn I saw the porch swing moving again. I didn't stop. When I finally made it to the nearest town, I stopped at the small diner to get some coffee. As I sat down at the counter, I couldn't help but overhear the conversation between the waitress and an older man sitting nearby. He was talking about the cabin I had rented. "I wouldn't go up there alone," he said, his voice low. "That place has a history. People say it's been abandoned for years, but sometimes people still go up there." I listened, my heart pounding in my chest. The waitress nodded, but I didn't catch the rest of the conversation. All I could think about was the cabin and the strange feeling I had left behind. When I finally asked the waitress about it, she just shook her head. "It's a place that's been around for a long time. People come and go, but no one ever stays long. There's a reason for that." I paid for my coffee and left the diner, the unease creeping back into my thoughts. But for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't expect it to go this way. No one could have, really. The cabin had seemed like the perfect getaway at first. Quiet, remote, and nestled deep in the woods. I'd been wanting a break for so long, just a few days away from the city, from the constant noise, the people, the clutter, a place to clear my head, breathe, and relax. I found the place online. The listing looked good. An isolated cabin, no neighbors, miles from the nearest road. Just the kind of solitude I needed. I thought it would be easy. Just pack a bag, rent the place, and head out. Simple. But the second I arrived, things started to feel off. The cabin itself was small, built from dark wood, its edges weathered and rough, giving off an old-world charm. It sat near the edge of a dense forest. The trees, tall and ancient, lined the property, their branches heavy with the weight of winter. The whole area was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it, the silence. It was so thick, like the air was holding its breath, and the ground felt unnaturally still beneath my feet. I shook it off, though. I mean, what else could I do? I was already there. It wasn't like I could just turn around and leave. The interior of the cabin was exactly what I expected. Cozy but bare. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a sofa and a fireplace, and a bedroom with a big bed covered in an old quilt. It smelled musty, like dust and forgotten memories, but not in a bad way. It had character, the kind of character that made you feel like you were stepping into something that had been there far longer than you had. I unpacked quickly, trying to ignore the strange sense of unease settling in my chest. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation. I'd never spent this much time alone before, not in a place like this. Sure, I'd been on camping trips and stayed at cabins before, but this one felt different. The first night went by uneventfully. I ate a simple dinner, read a little, and went to bed. The bed creaked under me, but I still managed to fall asleep despite the odd noises coming from outside. The wind, the cracking of branches, the occasional screech of some animal in the distance. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows, and for a brief moment, I felt calm again. It was going to be a peaceful retreat, I told myself. Just a few days to reset. But as I ventured outside to stretch my legs, something made me pause. A strange marking on the cabin's front door. At first, I thought it was a smudge, maybe dirt or something left by the wind. But when I looked closer, I realized it was a symbol. A crude drawing, scratched into the wood, almost like someone had carved it there recently. It was a circle with jagged lines coming off it, like lightning bolts or something more abstract. My heart raced for a second, but I pushed the thought out of my mind. It's probably nothing, I whispered to myself. Maybe it's just old. I tried to move past it. I spent the day hiking around the area, exploring the forest, and taking photos of the landscape. The silence was suffocating, though. Not the peaceful kind of silence you get in nature, but a heavy, watchful kind of silence, as if the woods were waiting for something. Every now and then, I'd feel like I was being watched, like eyes were on me from the trees, though when I looked, nothing was there. That night, I sat by the fire, just staring into the flames, thinking about how weirdly tense I'd felt all day. It was like I wasn't alone. I heard things that didn't make sense. Faint rustling noises, branches snapping just outside the cabin. Nothing too loud, but it was enough to keep me on edge. I didn't sleep well that night. I woke up several times, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I'd been running. But each time I looked around the room, the shadows seemed normal. The cabin was still. No signs of anything unusual. I told myself it was just the nerves, the quiet, getting to me. By the third day, the unease had deepened. Every time I stepped outside, the woods felt closer, like they were encroaching on the cabin. The trees felt too thick, their limbs too twisted. I felt like I couldn't escape them, no matter which direction I walked in. Then, as I ventured deeper into the woods, I found something. A trail, not a hiking trail, not something that seemed man-made or regularly used. It was faint, hidden beneath the fallen leaves, barely visible unless you were really looking for it. My curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. The trail wound deeper into the forest, growing darker as the trees thickened around me. The air felt heavier here, the silence even more pronounced. I could barely hear anything but my own breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a clearing that I realized how far I'd gone. In the middle of the clearing was an old structure. It looked like an abandoned shed or a small cabin, but it was barely standing. Its roof had caved in, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. A feeling of dread washed over me. I should have turned back, but instead I walked closer. The door was ajar, and when I pushed it open, the smell hit me. Damp, moldy, decayed. The inside was empty, save for a few rusted tools scattered on the ground. But then, on the far wall, something caught my eye. More symbols. The same kind I'd seen on the cabin door. Crude, jagged markings etched into the wood, almost like they were trying to communicate something. I backed away, my pulse racing, my hands shaking. I wasn't sure what I had stumbled into, but I didn't want to find out. The walk back to the cabin felt longer. The trees seemed to press in on me, their branches reaching out like claws, the ground beneath me uneven and treacherous. When I finally made it back, I locked the door behind me, and for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel safe. That night, I stayed up late, my eyes flicking between the dark corners of the room and the window, expecting to see something, someone, watching me. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence, the weight of the woods pressing in on the cabin. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't supposed to be here. By the fourth day, I knew I had to leave. The cabin felt wrong. The woods felt wrong. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, I knew something was off. The unease in my chest had shifted into something darker, something more primal. Fear. I packed my bags, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But before I left, I stood there for a moment, staring at the strange symbol on the door again. The feeling in the pit of my stomach twisted. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I was starting to believe that it wasn't just some random marking. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it, a noise from outside, faint rustling. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it sounded different. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, listening. It was coming closer, a slow shuffle of footsteps, soft but unmistakable. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I cracked the door open, just a sliver, peeking through. There was nothing there, just the trees, the shadows. But then I saw something else, a figure, standing in the distance, partially hidden by the trees. Tall, thin, unmoving, watching. I slammed the door shut, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't stay here, not anymore. I ran to the car. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the bags I left behind or the cabin that had once seemed so inviting. The only thing that mattered was getting away. The drive back felt endless, my mind racing. Was I being followed? Was I imagining things? What was that figure? I didn't stop until I was back in the city, safe. But every time I close my eyes, I see it again, the figure standing between the trees, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a weekend getaway to clear my mind and get away from the noise of daily life. I'd been planning this for weeks, picking a trail in the mountains that looked easy enough for someone like me who wasn't exactly an experienced hiker, but still wanted to feel that rush of nature, the quiet and peace of being far away from the world. I had a backpack with water, snacks, and a few layers of clothing in case the weather turned. My phone was in my pocket, though I didn't expect to need it much, and I made sure my shoes were sturdy enough to handle a variety of terrain. The trail I chose was a well-known one. The map said it was only about 5 miles, mostly through forested areas, with a gentle ascent up the mountain to a clearing with a view. I thought it'd be a perfect way to spend the afternoon. The weather was perfect that day. Clear skies, the sun warming my back, and just enough of a breeze to keep things from getting too hot. I started at the trailhead just as the first few hikers were leaving, which I figured was a good sign. The trail didn't feel too crowded, but there were enough people around that I knew I wasn't alone. The path was well maintained at first, wide and easy to follow. Tall trees lined either side, their branches thick with leaves, creating a kind of canopy that shielded me from the sun. The air smelled fresh and earthy, the kind of smell that made you feel alive and grounded. Birds were chirping above me, and occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of leaves as small animals moved through the underbrush. As I walked, I kept thinking about how simple this all was. Just walking in the woods, taking in the sights and sounds, away from the stress and noise. Everything felt fine. I was on my own, and that thought made me feel free, like I could take my time, breathe, and just be. I wasn't rushing, just enjoying the scenery. The trail was winding a bit now, the path narrowing in places, but still nothing too difficult. After about an hour, I came across a section where the trees thinned out, revealing a small creek to the left. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was peaceful, and I stopped for a moment to take a drink of water from my bottle and listen to the creek's natural rhythm. That's when I first felt it. A chill, not from the weather, but from something else. It was as if someone was watching me, though I could see nothing unusual. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was just the isolation of the woods making me feel that way. Maybe it was just the quiet. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. But as I stood by the creek for a few minutes, stretching my legs and looking around, the feeling wouldn't go away. I continued on, but the unease lingered, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I usually would. The trail seemed less populated now, and the air around me had grown stiller, almost too still. The sunlight filtering through the trees was dimmer, the shadows growing longer as I climbed higher into the hills. Around a bend, I came across a clearing where the path split into two directions. One trail seemed to continue along the mountain ridge, while the other veered off into a dense thicket of trees. I paused, unsure of which way to go. Both trails were marked, but one seemed less worn, less traveled. It looked like it would take me deeper into the forest, and instinct told me to avoid it. I figured I'd stay on the more traveled path, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I should have taken the other trail. But I pressed on. The further I walked, the more quiet it became. The chirping of birds, which had filled the air when I started, grew sporadic. The rustling of the leaves and branches above me stopped altogether. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound, a faint, low thud in the distance, like something heavy had fallen to the ground or someone had kicked a rock. It was distant, but it wasn't the wind. I couldn't explain it. My heart began to race, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was a falling tree branch. Maybe it was an animal, something large, moving through the forest. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. A few minutes later, I came upon another fork in the trail. This one was even less distinct. The markings were faded, the signposts half buried under leaves. I stood there, trying to decide if I should turn around and head back to the first fork. But then I saw it, just for a second, a shadow moving between the trees. It was fast, and it was gone in an instant, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. I took the path that seemed more traveled, though it felt wrong now. The trees were closer, the air heavier. I couldn't tell if the sky was overcast or if the thick branches above were just blocking out the sunlight. The path narrowed further as I continued, and the ground under my feet started to slope downward. At the bottom of the hill, the trail opened up into a small valley, the sort of place that might have been beautiful if I wasn't so on edge. That's when I saw it. A cabin. A small, weather-beaten structure tucked back in the trees, barely noticeable unless you were right on top of it. It was old, the wood darkened by age, with a roof that looked like it might collapse any second. There were no windows, only a single door, and the door was slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks, feeling that same prickling sensation crawl up my spine. Who would build a cabin all the way out here? And why hadn't I heard about it in any of the trail descriptions? No one had mentioned anything about a cabin. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide what to do. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something, curiosity maybe, pulled me closer. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I could take a quick look and move on. There was no harm in that, right? I walked toward the cabin, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I was close enough, I paused again. The door creaked slightly in the wind, though there was no breeze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I reached for the handle. That's when I heard it. A voice, not clear, but unmistakable. A sound like a whisper, just out of reach of understanding. It didn't come from inside the cabin, but from somewhere deeper in the woods. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. Could have been another hiker, though I hadn't seen anyone in a while. Could have been the wind, though it was strangely still. I couldn't stay there, not now. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and the whispers, they weren't just my imagination. They were real. Slowly, I turned around, the dread in my chest turning into a solid lump of fear. Without thinking, I started back toward the path, faster this time, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. I didn't dare look behind me as I hurried down the trail. My mind was racing, but all I could think about was the whispers. They weren't in my head. They weren't a trick of the wind. They were real, and they were getting closer. But when I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, as if the air itself had changed. The sunlight felt warm again, and the birds had returned to their calls. It was only when I reached my car and locked the doors that I dared to breathe. I had never been so relieved to be back in civilization. I've always preferred solitude. There's something about being away from people, surrounded only by nature and your thoughts, that feels right. I grew up in a small town, and even though I moved to the city a few years ago for work, I always found a way to return to the familiar silence of the woods whenever I could. Something about it calms me, makes me feel at peace in a way nothing else can. So, when I had a few days off, I decided to take a solo trip into the woods again. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat. Just me, my backpack, and the untouched wilderness. No phone signal, no distractions. I've done this countless times before without issue. But this time, things felt different from the moment I stepped off the trail and into the woods. I parked my car at the base of the mountain, where the road turns into a narrow dirt path. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I checked my bag again, making sure I had everything I might need. A tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a map, a flashlight, and extra batteries. The essentials. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and I started walking deeper into the forest. The trail wasn't difficult, but it was steep in some places, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew long and stretched across the ground like dark fingers. I wasn't worried, this was my element. I was used to it. I walked for hours, enjoying the quiet, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call. I had a general sense of where I was going, a small clearing about 5 miles in that I loved camping at. But as the light began to fade, I started to realize something strange. The air had grown colder, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, almost as if the entire place had quieted down for some reason. Even the wind, which usually rustled through the branches, was eerily still. I checked my watch, it was getting late. I knew I wasn't far from the clearing, but something about the atmosphere felt off. I quickened my pace, but the stillness seemed to follow me. The further I went, the more uncomfortable I became. The woods felt too empty. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was a small, flat area with a ring of trees surrounding it, and it always felt safe, like it was a place where the outside world couldn't reach me. I set up my tent quickly, barely noticing the cold or the quiet anymore. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness had settled in completely. I lit my lantern, then sat outside for a while, staring into the flickering flame. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant rustling in the trees. I thought it was just the wind picking up, so I ignored it. But the rustling didn't stop. It got louder, like something was moving through the woods, heading in my direction. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was walking through the underbrush, twigs snapping underfoot. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The woods were supposed to be empty. No one came out here this deep into the wilderness, especially not at night. I was sure of that. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but trees, their tall, dark shapes looming in the distance. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a person, or at least it looked like one, emerged from the trees. It was tall, thin, and oddly shaped, almost as if it wasn't fully standing upright. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the silhouette of someone moving slowly toward me. The flashlight's beam bounced off the figure's form, but it didn't seem to illuminate it fully. It was as though the light couldn't reach it, or it absorbed the light instead. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? But there was something strange about the way it moved, unnatural, stiff, like it was dragging its legs behind it. And the way it was slowly approaching, it wasn't like someone walking toward me. It was deliberate, methodical, like it had all the time in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crept into my mind. The figure didn't speak, didn't make any noise except for the sound of its footsteps. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. My mind raced. It was too far to run, and I wasn't about to make the first move toward it. I had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but there was a gut feeling telling me not to approach. I backed up slowly, then turned and bolted toward my tent. My breath was sharp, ragged in my chest as I scrambled to get inside, fumbling with the zipper as my hands shook uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to get it shut. I collapsed against the side of the tent, heart racing, every muscle tense. Outside, the figure didn't follow immediately. I listened, trying to hear any sounds. Footsteps, breathing, but it was silent. Too silent. The only sound was the rush of blood in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight again, but as I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, I found nothing. The clearing was empty. I waited. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. There was no way that figure had just disappeared. Then I saw it again. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the trees. But this time I could see it clearly. It was a man, at least it looked like a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, but there was something deeply wrong about him. His face was pale, almost gray, with hollow, empty eyes that stared straight at me. His expression was blank, emotionless, as if he wasn't aware of me, but at the same time, he was staring directly at me. I froze again, unable to move, unsure if I should scream or run. I thought about reaching for my phone, but I realized it wasn't in my bag. My heart hammered, my breath shallow and fast. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop staring into those dark, empty eyes. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange urge to follow him. A sick curiosity clawed at me, urging me to leave the safety of my tent and venture into the dark forest after him. But I didn't. I stayed put, frozen in place. When morning finally came, the figure was gone. The woods were empty again, just as they should have been. The sun rose over the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to enjoy the usual calm of the morning. I didn't feel safe anymore, and I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. I made my way back down the trail, trying to ignore the strange feeling of being followed, of something watching me just out of sight. It wasn't until I reached my car and started driving back toward the town that I felt like I could breathe again. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something move in the woods behind me. I never went back to that place. Maybe I'll never understand what happened, but I don't need to. Some things are better left unexplained. All I know is that the woods aren't as peaceful as they seem, and sometimes there are things out there that don't belong. The sun had long since set, leaving only the distant glow of streetlights behind me. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours. The highway stretched endlessly, an empty, dark ribbon winding through fields and woods. I was alone, with no service on my phone, and a sense of isolation that seemed to close in with every mile I drove. It had been a long day, and I was just trying to get home. My GPS had started acting up, and I had made the mistake of taking a detour, hoping to avoid the heavy traffic on the main roads. What had started as a shortcut soon turned into a long, winding path through nowhere. I didn't even know the name of the town I was heading toward anymore, just that it was supposed to be a small place with a motel. The motel was the only reason I was still going. I had no other options. The darkened landscape around me was unsettling. A thick fog had started to roll in, seeping in through the trees on either side of the road. The headlights of my car barely made a dent in the thick mist. I tried to keep calm, but something in the air felt off, something I couldn't explain. The road, now barely more than a narrow strip, twisted and turned like a snake, and the occasional pothole made my car jolt, waking me from my daydreaming. I glanced at the clock. 3:42 a.m. I had to stop. My eyes were heavy, and I could feel the weight of fatigue setting in. There were no towns around, no signs of life, just trees and darkness. But I knew I couldn't keep going. My mind felt foggy, and the last thing I wanted was to drive off the road because I'd nodded off. I spotted a small dirt shoulder a few yards ahead. It was a risk, no telling what could be lurking out there, but it was better than pushing my luck. I slowed down, turned off the road, and parked the car. The engine died with a soft hum, and the world around me fell completely silent. The fog was thicker now, pressing in like an unseen weight. I couldn't see much more than the outline of the trees surrounding me. My headlights illuminated a small patch of dirt and weeds, but beyond that, nothing. I reclined my seat, trying to get comfortable. The thought of sleep felt like a luxury. My eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, I almost drifted off. But then I heard it. Footsteps, faint but distinct, crunching on the gravel just outside my window. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. I sat up straight, my senses on high alert. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the footsteps didn't come closer. They just stopped. Maybe it was a deer, I told myself, trying to rationalize the sound. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That was no deer. I waited, trying to steady my breathing. The sound didn't return, but the unease didn't leave me. I turned the engine back on, ready to pull away if anything felt off. I glanced at the rearview mirror. The fog had thickened, and the headlights only lit up a small distance behind me. Everything looked still. I debated whether to stay put or leave. There was no one else on this road. I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no reason to feel like I wasn't alone, right? Just then, I heard it again. A faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the dirt, came from behind the car at the back, near the trunk. My heart thudded in my chest. I gripped the wheel, my hands sweaty. There was no way it was an animal this time. Something or someone was out there. Slowly, I turned the ignition key, easing the car forward, ready to peel away if I had to. But then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, there was a figure standing just outside the reach of my headlights, barely visible through the thick fog. The shape of a person standing completely still. Panic shot through me. Who would be out here at this hour? And why were they just standing there? I thought about the nearest town. It was at least 30 miles away, and I had no idea if there was anyone around. I considered calling for help, but my phone was dead, and there was no signal. I couldn't stay here, not with that person so close. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. I didn't even look back. My eyes were locked on the road ahead, hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The fog seemed to close in on me even more as I drove faster, my headlights barely cutting through the haze. Every turn in the road felt like it could be the one where something was waiting. Every tree, every shadow became a potential threat. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me, a cold presence that I couldn't shake. I must have driven for another 10 minutes, my car speeding along the empty road, the faintest sound of tires on gravel the only thing I could hear. Then I saw it, lights. Real lights, not just the dim glow of my headlights. A cluster of lights appeared through the mist, flickering through the trees. It was a small building, maybe a cabin or a diner. I didn't care what it was. I needed somewhere safe. I pulled into the parking lot, heart still racing. The fog was so thick I could barely see the outline of the building in front of me, but the lights inside were bright. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, just listening. The car was silent, the world around me muffled in the thick fog. I stepped out, hesitating before walking toward the entrance. The door was ajar, and the quiet inside made it feel abandoned. But then I saw someone standing behind the counter. A man with dark, tired eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded when he saw me. "You lost?" he asked, his voice raspy from the smoke. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just needed a place to stop for the night." "You're lucky," he muttered. "We don't get many travelers this far out." He gave me a strange look, like he was trying to figure me out. "What's your name?" I hesitated, but answered, "Anna." He didn't reply right away, just took a long drag from his cigarette and stared out the window. "You should be careful around here," he finally said, flicking the ash into a tray. "It's a strange place. People come and go, but you never really know what's out there." I blinked, unsure if he was being cryptic or if I had missed something. He shook his head as if clearing a thought. "Sorry, long night. Just stay inside tonight. Don't wander off." The warning wasn't lost on me, but I didn't have the energy to press him further. I asked for a room, paid, and made my way down the hall. The motel room was small but clean, the kind of place where time felt frozen, stuck in the past. The bed creaked when I lay down, but I didn't care. I needed sleep more than anything. I thought about the figure in the fog, the strange feeling that had followed me. I thought about the man behind the counter and his odd warning. But exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a dreamless sleep, the fog outside pressing in against the windows. Morning came, bright and cold, and when I opened my eyes, the world felt different. The fog had lifted, and sunlight streamed in through the small window. But something was wrong. The man behind the counter was gone. The motel was completely still, quiet. As I packed my things, I glanced at the window, noticing a shape on the horizon. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a figure, standing still in the distance. I left quickly, heart still pounding from the strange events of the night before. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was nothing in the fog anymore. No figure, no strange shapes, just the road ahead. But the feeling didn't leave me. I didn't stop at that motel again. Couldn't. The memory of that night, the figure in the fog, the man's warning, it all stayed with me. Some places, some roads are better left unexplored. And sometimes the scariest part is not what you see, but what you can't explain.